Let's get it in. You do this back, made back, roof is back. Tell the whole world the truth is back.
Hi, I'm Billy Mays.
Where my hustlers, where my boosters at? I don't care what you do for stack. I know the world glued you back to the wall. You gotta run through that. I've been through that, been shot at, shoot that. Gotta keep a peace like a Buddhist. I ain't a new jack, nobody gon' Wesley snipe me. It's less than likely that I bring Jedi Knight. The more space I get, the better I write. Oh, never I write.
Oh, I believe we're live. We're live from Salina. It always catches me off every time because I'm not used to being live, even though we've done it for about 6 months. I'm James Lowe. We're live here, Access Television, live on salinatv.org, Channel 21 in Saline County, and of course, I believe we're also live on the old Facebook this evening as well. I'm James Lowe. I've got Gary Schwartzendruber. We've got a representative with us. We have Nelson L. We're going to have everybody do their own introduction here in just a few moments. But before we get to that, I believe it was late last week, one of my good friends from the world of social media, who actually was a representative in Topeka, Patsy Terrell, passed away. And we were shocked. We were saddened by this turn of events. But she helped steer a lot of good changes, and we'll have Jim talk about those. And I just wanted to, before we got everything going with our panel and our studio audience, just reflect and thank Patsy for all of her service and remember her on this evening. Let's start with Gary Schwartzendruber. Go ahead and introduce yourself, my friend. Give us a brief introduction on yourself.
I will. Gary Schwartzendruber from Salina, here 33 years. Born and raised in Michigan, studied in Indiana, University of Iowa, wound up faculty at Iowa State University, went into John Deere business with my father-in-law, have run for office, can't ever quite win, but I love the whole experience. It's good to be on the panel tonight with Representative Jim Ward running for governor.
That must be breaking news. I didn't know anything about that. Nelson, go ahead and introduce yourself. Maybe we'll have Jim explain that here in a few. Go ahead, Nelson.
Nelson L., author of the book, The Introduction to the Truth of Life, as well as the founder of Kansas Underground Railroad Historical Society, and counselor, mentor, artist, writer, so on and so forth.
You pretty much do a little bit of everything, my friend.
Absolutely.
Thank you for being here. Ross, we have our good buddy Ross Long joining us on the old Skype-a-rooney tonight. Ross, give us a introduction on yourself, my friend.
That's me, Ross Long, skipping in on the Skype from 450 miles away out here in Pueblo, Kansas. Why am I here? Because I taught Jiggy how to do this, basically. is, but no, Jiggy and I are buds. James Lowe, our host tonight.
Whichever you want to refer to me as.
And it's just great to be on with you tonight. Nelson L., it's a special treat to see you. It's going to be great talking with you. And Mr. Ward, I hope you've got good things for Kansas.
Representative, go ahead and give us a brief introduction on yourself, my friend.
I'm Jim Ward. I come from Wichita. I represent Southeast Wichita. I've had the privilege of serving in the Kansas House for 15 years. I'm currently the minority leader. I've also had the opportunity to serve on the Wichita City Council and the 259 School Board, and I also served in the State Senate briefly.
Now, let's start at the top here. I mentioned Patsy. She was part of this tax vote, successful veto override. Give me a little bit of comments and feedback on that whole thing that happened last week.
Patsy was very special. I recruited her. She's from Hutchinson. She ran and defeated a 22-year incumbent, and she was just pure raw energy, just happy energy. And I know she spent the last day of her life in a very important business, and she would say that herself. She was part of the group that overrode the governor's veto, and we were able to pass income tax reform. And I saw her around 11 o'clock that night, and she was just very happy to be part of that. She said, I'm so happy I got to be a tiny part of that historic event. And she was more than a tiny part.
Now, let's talk about this veto. What does that mean for the audience watching us around the world and here in Kansas?
how the process works is a bill is worked through the House and the Senate. They reach agreement on common language. If it passes, it goes to the governor. The governor has three choices. In fact, the governor did all three of them today. One is he can sign the bill, whereupon it becomes law. Two, he can veto the bill, which sends it back to us for further action. Or he can do nothing and it will become law without his signature. On the income tax reform bill, he chose to veto it, so it came back to the House and the Senate, and we were able to get super majorities to override his veto. We had 88 votes in the House out of 125, which is incredibly hard to do, and there was 27 senators out of 40, and it's hard to get 27 senators to agree where to go to lunch, let alone an income tax reform bill. So it was a very important day for Kansas. It put us back in the business of fiscal responsibility. You'll stop hearing every month where revenues don't meet estimates. You'll stop reading about Moody's downgrading our credit. In fact, they released within 48 hours that our credit history had stabilized because of this. So it was a big day, and I was glad Patsy got to be part of that.
Now, Nelson, sitting here on the panel and hearing all this and being a leading voice in the African American community and everything, what do you make of Jim and some of the things that they've managed to be able to do up there?
Well, you know, one, I know he's got a tough uphill fight to get anything done. You know, Kansas has always been a red state, and so to be a Democrat in a red environment, it's tough. Yeah. You know, so I really kind of just applaud him sticking in there. Trying to get some of these things passed is you know, almost like pulling teeth. So I just commend him on fighting a good fight, man, because it's just it's an uphill battle right now. But things are changing, you know, just like things are changing out collectively amongst the nation. You know, things are shifting now, and I think that's why it's just a good time to have the right person in the right position. Because when things do shift, if you've got the position, then we can do what it takes to affect the public policy to bring about the change that everybody is really kind of screaming out for right now.
Now, we also have a studio audience this evening as well. We have a town hall, and we're going to allow some of them to ask some questions a little bit later. I do want to go to Gary. You made a comment at the top of the show here about him running for governor. Where did you get this information?
Well, I just keep my ears wide open and my mouth as closely shut as I can.
Which is hard for you.
It's kind of hard for me. By the way, there are a couple folks out behind the curtains that would be welcome to come in. They would not interrupt the program. Is
No,
that right?
Anybody and everybody while we're live here can come in and take a seat here.
Yeah.
Now, to follow up on that, I have heard these rumors. What is your actual official statement on on the possibility of running? I hate to put you on the spot, but Gary kind of he didn't seek parental permission.
He's all over Facebook.
Went out there.
I am very happy as the House Minority Leader, but I have to say, particularly after Paul Davis, the former Minority Leader and our last governor candidate, stepped out, I had a lot of serious, important people that I took their opinions very seriously come to me and say, you should look at this. And I said, look, my first job is to the people of the 86th District in Wichita and to the Democratic caucus who gave me this privilege of being their leader. Once we're done, which we just finished up last Saturday, then I'll sit down and start looking at what it takes to run for governor, how you would put together something like that. So I'm in the process of doing that right now.
Fantastic. Now, Ross, sitting here and listening to the representative and also some of the research you've done on this gentleman, do you have any questions for our guest this evening?
I have to applaud you. I mean, you had to get plenty of Republicans to go over party lines to get the override of his veto that way. That just shows that, in my opinion, that Kansas is ready to dump this, you know, experiment by the glorious governor there. And basically, he's politically dead after this when he's out. But so you were talking about fiscal responsibility. Well, how specifically are you going to meet that? Do you figure, Mr. Ward, or what direction should the state go in to meet that responsibility? Is how I'd like to start it out.
Well, I want to address two things both Nelson and you brought up. I really believe while Kansas is a red state, we're pretty much common sense, fiscally responsible, middle to a little right. Brownback and his followers went way right. I mean, they didn't go a little right, they went way right. They took the full drink of Kool-Aid. And Kansas didn't like that. And you've seen over the last 3 or 4 elections them try to pull the state back to the middle. And I think really what happened in 2016 was a group of both moderate, traditional Republicans and Democrats won elections because people wanted representation that was more solution-oriented rather than ideological. And I think that was the result what you saw going on in Topeka. Not only did we reform the income tax, but we put together a gun safety bill that would keep guns out of hospitals and mental institutions. We got an oversight of the Department of Children and Family, whose job it is to protect our most vulnerable children. So we won't pick up the paper anymore and read about a child murdered, dismembered, and thrown into a pig pen so their bones could be eaten because DCF wasn't doing their job. We're tired of reading about that, and we took some steps to do that. The most important part of the income tax reform was the fact that 330,000 people who were using services in Kansas will now return to the tax rolls in income tax and contribute to the common good. That's a huge piece. We'll no longer have the idea that we're going to get rid of income tax. It's going to be a solid part of our three-legged stool of financing state government core services. And we reinvested in things that most Kansans think are core services. We put money back into the mental health institutions. We have one that's closed because it's unsafe. And so we put money back into Osawatomie, money into Larned. We put money into local mental health. We restored funds that had been taken out of the Senior Care Act, which like Meals on Wheels. We gave state employees a pay raise, some for the first time in 5 to 10 years.
Yes.
And it wasn't a huge one. It might cover the cost of their insurance increase, but it was something to say we respect what they do. We did a lot of things like that that I hope restores people's faith that state government can meet its obligations while being fiscally responsible.
Fantastic. We've got some people here in our audience. If you guys would like to approach the mic and have a question for the representative or our panel, please do so. While we're waiting on that, Nelson, are you getting, as a young voter and as connecting with your community, whether it's young people or African Americans or both, are you getting the kind of answers at a gym here that?
I am. I'm listening. You know, part of why I showed up was just to kind of hear what you had to say on certain issues and topics. And so what I'm hearing are things that I'd like to hear. But then, like Ross said,
Yes.
we've got to put some action behind it.
Yep.
You know, a lot of times we hear the political campaign rhetoric, and then nothing happens. Understanding we're dealing with politics, that's kind of, I don't know, I wouldn't call it an oxymoron, but to get some action in a political arena, it's almost, that's a pretty big thing to do. But I definitely am liking what I'm hearing. I have some other things I want to throw on the table when we get into it, and just kind of see where how things are falling out.
Well,
but
we have a member of our studio audience who would like to ask a question. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Janice Morris, and I live in this area. My question is concerning my sister. She is an employee at K-State Salina Polytechnic, and she has not had a pay raise in 12 years. She unfortunately was part of the group that opted out of the civil service part. Will they get this 5% pay raise?
Yes. As I understand it, if you've been less with the state of Kansas less than 5 years, you get a 2.5% pay raise. If you've been with the state longer than 5 years and haven't gotten a pay raise in that 5 years, then you'll get the 5%.
Okay, that's what I wanted to know. Thank you.
And it really is high time and past due time because those people work incredibly hard. We've reduced the state employee workforce, and they're doing more with less, and they've done a great job. And this is a small step. I'm not going to sit here and tell you this solves the problem. We have to continue to reinvest in our workforce because that's the first. Most people don't see me at the Capitol. They see the people working for them in various offices, and we want to make sure that we have a quality workforce.
She is paying more for her health insurance, the co-pays have gone up, and they're charging more for them to park out there, and gave them no pay raise. So she really appreciates your 5%.
Tell your sister thank you for her service.
Now, Gary, you had a question about budget.
Yeah. Could you tell us what the budget will be for the upcoming year? And also the amount of what they call indirect expenditures, and explain what that is. Now, I know very well what it is, but I don't think most of the viewing audience does.
Maybe you better lead in a little bit for me.
Well, okay. Okay. Well, I know you know the budget. Indirect expenditures, and I investigated this pretty strongly for Phil Black at one time when he ran for state representative. Indirect expenditures are all the tax breaks, tax loopholes, good, bad, and in between. For example, started out 191,000 of LLCs paid zero tax, and then there were 380,000 of them at one time doubled, because me included, a lot of people changed from subchapter S partnership in a regular corporation. Like, guess what? I can be this LLC and pay zero income taxes. And thank you, Governor. We're not going to expand business. We're not going to hire any more people, but thanks a lot. We're going to run you in the hole. Brownback promised that at the end of 8 years, there'd be $1.5 billion surplus, and we're basically 1.5 in the hole now.
Yeah,
as I understand. So the indirect,
because that is a great point, because you can basically go from being an individual to a business now and pay no taxes.
well, except this now got overturned, and as I like to put it, after this last election cycle, Governor Brownback has 22 fewer puppets on puppet strings than what he had. And I mean, you guys were able to.
I wish you wouldn't be so closeted with your opinions and views on Brownback and the government.
Let me take a crack,
Yeah,
okay?
yeah.
We spend about $12 to $13 billion total. And that means anything that Medicaid, reimbursements for the federal government, the highway money, fishing license, hunting license, every source of money. A lot of that is siloed or required to be spent in some way. The area where we have the most discretion as a legislator is about the $6.5 billion we call state general fund. Yeah. For those of you watching this at home, it's kind of like your checking account. That's where schools come from. That's where the Senior Care Act. Yeah. And because of the income tax reform we were able to do, we stabilized that budget so that we don't continually have those monthly reports saying we weren't meeting our expectations. Moody's and Standards were downgrading us. And all of the things that we were talking about, like the state employees, the mental health institutions, our schools are being declared unconstitutional, all because of this experiment. Now, tax loopholes is an interesting term, and I absolutely thought the LLC was a tax loophole that benefited the upper 1 or 2%. Yep. There are some good uses of tax policy and incentives to try to get people to invest in communities, to make communities more attractive for those kinds of investments. But I always, when I was on the city council and when I was state legislature, mine has always been, how many jobs are you going to retain, or how many jobs are you going to create, and how long are you here? Am I just the next one on your dance card until you're done with us, and are you moving down the road? Or are you really going to invest in our community? Are you really going to make Salina or Wichita home? Yeah. And those are the kind of criteria. Those are not all bad. But the idea that you would tell 330,000 people, don't pay income tax because we think there'll be some long-term effect, didn't make sense to me in 2012, and it still doesn't. So I was happy to vote for the bill and for the override. And I think Kansas will be better because of it.
That's good.
Now, we have another audience member with a question. Go ahead, sir.
Hi, I'm John Waterman. I've been here in Salina for a bit, but I originally grew up on the East Coast. And we seem to have a more, growing up there and living here now, there seems to be a bigger emphasis for education there, and the way it's going to affect the future in whole. Now, and there's a great debate between private school and public schools, which way we should go. And to me, private schools seem to be ran more on corporate ideologies, which I think is a fallacy. So I know you had some background in education with K-State and so forth, and I was wondering where you think we should go politically in direction towards education, and what we can do as community members. What direction should we go?
Let me take the first question about public education. There is little that we do that have long-term consequences. We just keep the ship afloat. with one exception, and that's public schools. If that is the one silver bullet, that if we do that right, Kansas will grow and be the state that we all know and love and have been for years. We have to make that investment. That's the most important thing I can do as a state representative. And I believe it should be based on what kids need. And I think what we did this year in reforming our education formula, which was to go back to say, we're going to fund each child that walks to that door. And then we're going to recognize that some kids come with different challenges, and we're going to give schools extra for those kids who have additional challenges to learning, such things as living in homes in poverty with one parent, one thought. Not that they aren't loved, aren't being taken care of, but we know that they bring more challenges to the classroom. If they speak a language other than English, where we have to teach them English before we can teach them math, that's going to cost more. Special education. We also invested in all-day kindergarten because the literature, the people who study education said kids are learning at an earlier age than we ever thought, and we need to get started sooner so they can be successful. And we also recognize that 4-year-olds, especially if they live in families that are at risk, having challenges, should get some investment. We did all of that. Now, the second question you ask is, what's our role as the state government in private schools? I'm of the camp that we should do less, okay? Our primary focus, our constitutional duty, and our public responsibilities to public schools. Now, not saying private schools aren't excellent parts of our community, don't do a wonderful job in educating kids, and in any number of them you can point to and see successful educating going on. The question is, should we put public dollars there? And one of the things we did was I call it voucher scholarships, but that kind of thing. That's an add-on. We can debate the merits of that program, but we ought to take care of our prime directive under the Constitution is our public schools, and we aren't there yet. So I'm less in favor of that shifting of public dollars to private schools until we get the public schools right. And then if there's extra money and they make a good case, I'm okay talking about that, but primarily those public schools.
Well, thank you. I also had a question. You definitely have a lot of experience in juvenile corrections. And I think that would be that could be a great area to actually be a net to catch the people that fall through the cracks and really educate them there at a different level. You can really find the people that are falling through the cracks there.
Right. And there are two silos or two methodologies we interact with children who are in distress. One is in the criminal field. And there is always this constant tension. How much do we spend in terms of rehabilitation? Because when you're talking about kids with a lifespan of 90 or 100 years, I mean, you should get it right as soon as possible so that they have an opportunity to live productive lives. Because if you screw it up, you're going to pay for it on the other end too. Yep. So you always have that, got to punish, because we got to make sure that we understand the rule of law, but how much do we spend in making sure that they get what needed so they don't go that direction? The other area, which I've spent a lot of time with, is those children that are in families that have tragedies or are abused physically, sexually, emotionally, neglected. That's the Department of Children and Families, and our current administration has done an absolutely appalling job. And that's where we're talking about the child we were described earlier. It's too many kids have been murdered in custody. We have 3 post-audits that have indicated flaws in the implementation of this. Most vulnerable children. And so we have to continue to push because these kids deserve it.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Now, before we go back to our audience, Ross, you held up. What was it you held up earlier? You were. I'm assuming that you have a question for the representative here.
I was practicing for my next question. You bet. So I'll just go ahead and ask it. Well, here it is. This is cannabis oil or CBD oil, and basically it has 0.3% of 1% of THC in it. It will not get you high. It's legal to ship all over the 50 states. They make it here in Colorado. I'm hoping that, right next door to Colorado, Kansas has probably the most prohibition on anything having to do with marijuana. I understand just about a week ago, back, I think it was in Shawnee Mission or somewheres back east, that way. They closed down, or they didn't close down, but they made a little herb shop get rid of all their CBD oil because they didn't like that 0.3 of 1%. Even though you could drink 10 gallons of this and it's still not going to get you high. I'm just, what ultimately my question is, Kansas was a very big state in growing hemp back in the 20s and in the 30s. I mean, they can't eradicate the fields that they have now still. I'm just wanting to know what's your attitude on that, and should we kind of lean up, lay off some of the marijuana laws? I mean, I think that would be one of the best things for Kansas that they could possibly do.
Okay, in my field, we're in politics, so we can make anything complicated, and so we'll make this complicated. There are 3 tiers of the question. The first is what you call hemp, and there is a lot of momentum to do hemp because there's a lot of productive ways to use it. The most descriptive is child seizures. There's
Oh, yes.
a lot of medical evidence that hemp reduces child seizures, and we've gotten it past the House. The hemp only, which is marijuana without the high, is the best way to describe it. It's gotten through the House. It's run into some roadblocks in the Senate, but it also has other agricultural techniques. I think that has the best chance, that which you just held up in that little bottle. The second tier is marijuana itself and its use in medical uses, where you have a prescription and there's a number of physical ailments where marijuana, I think that's the next level, and it's not as likely as hemp, but that's the next. And then the full decriminalization like they have in Colorado. I don't think Kansas is there, but we have taken steps to reduce the incarceration for people arrested with marijuana as not really appropriate use of jail space, and it has such a negative impact on people's lives based on the consequence of using marijuana. So we have made some steps in reducing the penalty while still making it illegal. Hemp's your best chance. I think it'll probably be a couple of years. Education process with this kind of controversial stuff in the legislature, there's always a big learning curve.
Did that work, Ross? Did that satisfy?
Boy, that's an excellent answer. I applaud you, and yes, I hope you go forth and do what's right that way. Absolutely.
Well, we're going to go back to our studio audience. Mr. Phil Black, who was on our gun
And I'm not going to ask about guns. I'm Phil Black. I live here in Salina, and I've been, as Gary mentioned, I ran for state rep, and I've been on the school board. But I also taught American government at the college level. And since you brought up exemptions and potential use of those kinds of incentives, when I teach American government, I say their economic systems are on one end is complete laissez-faire free market capitalism versus government completely owns it socialism, and we're somewhere in between rather than just one or the other. When you decide if something is a good incentive or is not, what steps or process do you go to? What criteria do you look for in making that kind of a decision?
Good question, Phil. What I tend to do, particularly on the city council, because we had more opportunities, we'd had smaller dollar projects, but we had more opportunities to evaluate those versus the state.
But we had the STAR bonds recently.
Yeah,
which
and STAR bonds are, that's a good example. If you've been to Kansas City, Kansas, where the racetrack is, all of the legends in that whole area was developed with STAR bonds, which is a method of financing capital with tax incentives, and then you repay it with the profits of those businesses. Those kinds of things, when we don't have the detail, which is who's going to benefit, what kind of jobs are going to be created, and are you a long-term partner in the community, or am I just the third guy on your dance card, and as soon as you're done with my money, you're going to go to, and I'll tell you a good example of one I invested in for years and I was wrong. Boeing. Boeing was the poster child of government incentives or using the tax code to benefit or keep them, and they're hugely important. I mean, they're high-paying, good benefit, quality jobs that built an infrastructure, a cluster, a manufacturing cluster in Wichita, Kansas, and it was a huge thing. But when they got a better offer, they were out of town, and that's you don't know that. I mean, Boeing was a community partner for 50 years. And when you did the United Way or you did important things in your community, Boeing was always a partner. So you can't always tell, but those are the things I look for. What's your investment in terms of job creation? And it can be retention of jobs, keeping jobs in Kansas, or expanding the number of jobs. And then what's your long-term prognosis of staying in Kansas? Those tend to be the things I look at.
What if they're threatening to leave without getting a better deal?
Yeah.
Which is Boeing, since you brought it up.
That's the deal.
One of the first things I did on the city council 25 years ago, Pizza Hut was a Kansas company, born, raised, and grown here, came and asked for industrial revenue bonds, one of the tax incentives to build the building. It didn't make sense to me, and so I asked questions, and they basically said, we're going to move. What they forgot to tell us at the time was, we're already going to move, okay? And what happened is they got bought out by a bigger company, PepsiCo, and they're gone, the building's out there, and it's being used, but, so you don't know. I guess that's a lot of words to say. It's hard to tell, but you've got a criteria, and mine tends to be how many jobs you're going to keep, how many jobs are you going to expand, and what's your likelihood of staying long-term in my community.
And the other question regarding role of government is, I know with the Department of Ag at the federal level, there's all sorts of concerns what's going to happen with insurance policy and so forth for crop loss. What can the state government do to either stabilize or increase farm prices, produce prices? What can we do to help farmers at the state level?
We have fewer tools in the toolbox than they do at the federal level. We tend to be disaster relief. We tend to be there when there's droughts or the freezing snow or the fires we had not too far from here this summer. And we also are the bridge between what goes on in Washington and what happens locally. There's that state-federal partnership for some of that distributing of the money. But I think what we can do for local, small communities, rural Kansas, is we've got to empower, we've got to have good schools, okay? One of the things we haven't talked about is healthcare. You know, without expanding Medicaid, we put enormous stress on our healthcare system and hospitals and clinics. And while it has a huge impact on, be it Christie, which is a Wichita company, or Wesley, which is a Wichita hospital, it has enormous pressure on smaller communities. You look at Independence, Kansas, who lost a hospital. Even Topeka almost lost a hospital. All across that, we can do things to strengthen the healthcare system and provide those kinds of incentives. We've got to recognize that Wichita kids, school kids, and Johnson City, Kansas school kids are equally entitled to that education, and we've got to, but we deliver resources differently, and they have different needs. The same thing with healthcare and other benefits. But those are the kinds of partnerships I would see the state continuing.
Thank you.
Now Nelson, I've noticed you off and on while the representative's been answering questions from the audience and from Ross and Gary. You've been feverishly making notes. What do you have?
Well, I've just been taking notes in regard to the conversation, but what I would like to add to the conversation is I'm Kansas all the way through and through. I was born right here in Salina, Kansas. I graduated from Salina Central. I went to college at Butler County Community College in El Dorado. I live in Kansas City, Kansas. I mean, I'm Kansas. One thing that I noticed living all around the state of Kansas and being in Kansas, we don't talk about, and I feel like I'd be remiss not to bring this up, about the significance that Kansas played in the Underground Railroad, right? So, thinking about the Underground Railroad, and I just kind of want to get your take on this. This was a time when, you know, so-called black people, white people, Muslims, Christians, all worked together to change the course of America. If you think about the Civil War, if you think about that time, it was Kansas taking a stand saying we're going to be a free state and we're not going to be a slave state, and it actually changed the course of our nation. As Kansas went, the entire nation goes. If we go slave, then the chances are pretty good that everything else falls like dominoes. And we understand about the Electoral College. People were running other people up here to say that they were residents of either Kansas or Missouri. We know about Bleeding Kansas, the Quantrill Raiders. We know about the Jayhawks. We don't really talk about this in school. I think in Kansas City, Kansas, right there on 18th and Quindaro, which I'm sure you know, Quindaro means a bundle of sticks. That means we're stronger together. There is a lack of everything right there, right? This is some of the richest history that we have. John Brown was there. This is an abolitionist that came from Ohio to put his life on the line, not only his life, but the life of his sons for the freedom. Western University, right there on 27th Street in KCK, was the first school, much like Dunbar here in Salina, Kansas. My mother went to Dunbar before they allowed, before desegregation rather. Why don't we empower our young people and let them know that we have a rich history. And I think if young people in that particular part of Kansas, which happens to be the very poorest state, or county rather, Wyandotte County, they've made it the unified government now, but that pulls in Bonner Springs and some others, but Wyandotte County, there's not even a grocery store. I mean, people are feeding their children out of the Family Dollar. How come we don't shine a light on our rich history, how we impacted the entire nation? How come we don't say, this is what happens when we work together? This is what happens when we come together. Politics are so divisive these days. We never talk about what happens when we come together. And the fact of the matter is, when we come together, we free a nation. I think that we should shine a light on the Underground Railroad.
I couldn't agree more, Nelson. I think Kansas really, people don't realize the Civil War started in Kansas.
That's right.
And it started because there's a lot of reasons we don't like Missouri. That's just one of them. You know, and they thought they were going to come and tell us what kind of state we're going to be. We have a history that goes beyond the Underground Railroad, Civil War, desegregation of schools, Brown versus Board of
My grandmother, Geraldine Briscoe, sorry to cut you off, very instrumental. There's a building dedicated to her right now on Santa Fe. My mother started Martin Luther King Jr. Child Care Center. So this is kind of born and bred in me to stand up for the rights of some of those who don't have a voice. But I think by doing that, if we would stand up for those, that can actually galvanize us and bring us together. And if you're looking to pull some votes, I think if you said, you know what, we're going to shine a light, and this is something as the governor or potential governor I can do, is say, when you drive through Kansas City, Kansas, this is where slaves came into freedom. If we recognize where a nation of people went into slavery, how come we don't recognize or appreciate where they came out of physical bondage? And that happened right here in Kansas City, Kansas. We talk about Rosa Parks possibly being on the $20 bill. Well, Rosa Parks was born, not Rosa Parks, but Harriet Tubman, rather, excuse me. Harriet Tubman was born in Maryland. And so a lot of her freedom riding was Virginia, Maryland. We don't talk about what happened here on the western edge and how many of people lost their lives to preserve the character and the freedom, the liberties of everybody here. And those people were good white folks who hid people in churches. Those were good immigrants who came over here from Ireland or from in places in Europe, just different places all around. We don't talk about it. Our children don't know about it. If I ask maybe a member of the audience out here, what do you know about the Underground Railroad? I'm almost willing to wager that it would be very little. How come we don't highlight that?
We should. And I'll tell you, not only for the reasons you had enunciated, which are very important, but also at our time of very divisive politics in our world, very divisive, and it's us versus them and about everything. Those kinds of messages that when people did pull together, even in a very divisive time, you can't find a more divisive time than the Civil War, they were able to pull it together and the country survived. I think we'll get there. Voices like yours bringing that up are very important to making sure that we learn that. So we appreciate the comments. I learned just listening to you in the few minutes you've been speaking.
And Jiggy, I might want to jump in here.
Yes, go ahead,
There's
Ross.
more 160 and 170-year-old history in Kansas than any other place in the world. It's one of the most documented history that there is in the world. And I always thought it's kind of sad that like I used to tell people in Kansas, long before the anybody in the nation knew the name Abe Lincoln, we were fighting the Civil War. So yes, and I agree with you, Jim. It's you know, in these divisive times where things kind of comes to violence and fisticuffs, well, that's kind of how Kansas started many times. But yes, if there could be a push on tourism, I mean, you need dollars from out of state. You need people helping that sales tax base and you know, helping local communities that way just by coming through sometimes.
Well, the good news is, I think the people of Kansas sent a clear message in 2016 when they elected moderate Republicans over the ultra-conservatives. In a state that voted for Donald Trump with 57% of the vote, there are 14 new Democrats and plus 12. We went from 28 to 40, which allowed us to do some. And everybody goes, well, the key thing is moderates and Democrats are different. not all Democrats are alike. Not all moderates are alike, but there was a coming together and a recognition that solutions were more important at the end than all the political scorecard. You know, it's always a scorecard. And that's why you saw us be able to reform income tax this year, why you saw us make investment in public schools, why you saw the budget happen. Because at the end of the day, people who don't agree on everything thought that the solution was more important than how many of their little things they got. It wasn't pretty, but it's not supposed to be. This is important stuff. It was ugly and bloody, but at the end of the day, you look at the results, and I think Kansas will be happy with what happened in 2016 or 2017.
Maybe just to switch horses a little bit.
Go ahead.
What's the feeling as you left Topeka that Governor Brownback may accept the position of ambassador to world religions for the Trump organization? Is there some sense that may actually happen?
The governor's been rumored to be many jobs. Secretary of Agriculture, he was going to go to Rome. He's got this position that you just described.
Yeah.
I do believe the governor will join the Trump administration in some role. I think, now this will shock you, but he doesn't sit down and consult me about what he should do. My phone number he knows, and I'd be happy to share, but I think what's going on.
You would advise him.
I would advise him. Not that he would listen. The thing
But you'd have an ear.
I definitely have some opinions.
Yeah. Well,
But I think what's happening is he wants to get through this session. And like I said, he got several bills off his desk today.
Yeah.
The budget's still there. We're awaiting the Supreme Court review of our school finance. Now, I don't know if he'll leave with the finish of the bills that are on his desk and let our lieutenant governor deal with any court action if necessary. But I do think at some point when the legislative session is done, he will take a position with the Trump administration. That's my opinion.
well, and I'll just add, I will be praying to all 20,000 goddesses and gods that Governor Brownback will wind up being converted to the Muslim faith and come and turn into a way better person. For what that's worth.
Well, you know,
Keep praying.
keep praying.
Keep 20,000 goddesses. I tell you, there's
We can all use prayers. Everybody can use prayers.
Now, one thing that Gary and Nelson have both referenced, and they keep referencing you running for governor, even though you haven't officially decided yet.
Right.
What do you make of the potential for a Democratic primary in Kansas with Josh Savati and our guest we had on a couple months ago, Carl Brewer, and then if you happen to get in, then there would be you and then anybody else who
I
decided
like
to
that
go.
idea. I like that idea.
primaries.
So
are
now,
good.
now you've got all three of them wanting you to run for governor. So go ahead.
The
and-
good news is, I think the fact that you have a lot of people looking at Democrat office, running as a Democrat, means the energy in our party is better than it's been in the last 4 or 5 years. People really believe that our party is an opportunity to make the changes in Kansas that need to be. I think a primary can be very healthy. It gets people energized, it gets them talking about Democratic candidates, it gets things moving forward. The candidates have to make sure that they run their races to win. But remember, 2 words that will motivate Democrats throughout the November election: Chris Kobach. And we got to keep our eye on the target. At the end of the day, winning a primary only gets you 90 more days of campaigning.
That's right.
The goal is to have the opportunity to make the changes in Kansas, to
Yeah.
continue the rebuilding that started this year,
Yeah.
so that the state is stronger.
Will Derek Schmidt run, in your humble opinion?
This is another, I don't know why the Attorney General hasn't called and asked my advice, but he hasn't. My crystal ball is foggy. Derek is a very formidable candidate. He is Attorney General. He served as a senator for several years. I hope he continues to be Attorney General. He's doing a good job.
And see, you bring up a point that I like about Derek Schmidt is that you never hear any nasty, horrible things this guy has done. He's just done his job.
We'll wait till he
Why
runs for
can't
governor.
Then it'll all come out.
Right,
Now,
that's right.
well, let's
Usually
go
does.
back to our studio audience. We have a question from the audience. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi. I've been studying recently, and I've learned also that there are some some groups that are kind of turned off on voting, and also that the election commissioners around the state are kind of have been urging for post-election audit legislation, and it doesn't even seem to be really on the table as far as I can tell. And I think, you know, making voting easier, I mean, getting rid of some of those restrictions that seem to be popping up all the time, and having that audit to make it more trustworthy, make people feel comfortable about voting and the results and making their vote count, might pull in more of the younger groups, the groups that are disenfranchised. And I was wondering, you know, could you talk a little bit about that?
Right. I couldn't agree with you more. The most important piece of democracy is the right to vote. The fact that you get to pick your leaders, whether they be at precinct people to governor or president, you as a citizen get to vote. That's the most important thing. That's one of my biggest differences with the current Secretary of State, who has gone out of his way to suppress votes in a way that's very destructive to democracy, not only in Kansas, but he's trying to push that nationwide. His argument is that, well, one or two people voting in the wrong place will turn an election. What you bring up is much more concerning, which is the mathematician from Wichita State University, Ms. Clarkson, who all she said is there looks to be an anomaly in these machines in these high Republican districts. I don't know if it's there or not. I just want to look. And the Secretary of State not only refused her, but when legislation was proposed, he opposed the legislation, which kind of made his argument it's all about fraud less real for people. But despite that, despite what he's doing, you still got to vote. It matters. And it really, you can point to times in history when candidates and movements for change have motivated people of color, people of youth, poverty, all of those groups that tend to underperform in elections. That's very important, and it matters. I mean, I was on a committee where a guy won by 2 votes. He had 4 on election night by the time we were done counting. And the difference between the person that he beat and his vote on education, on health care, on infrastructure, on access to voting was dramatically different. We had an election settled in the House, that's been several years ago, by a backgammon chip. And no one can forget 2008, where we didn't know who won 500 votes in Florida. So one vote matters, and it matters a huge amount. But it's our job as people running and trying to get your vote to give you a reason, to make it real to you and make it something that you think by going out and giving up your time and making that effort, that something positive will happen for your community. And we have to fight every day against Chris Kobach's suppressionist policies.
And Jim, I just might want to add here, in Colorado, we've gone to all mail ballots, and even our minor elections, like for local, you know, aldermen and council people and all, it gets over 70% participation rate. I mean, and I'm all for people voting, which it seems like you are. The only downside to the whole thing, it just means that when you make it far, far easier to vote, well, more Republicans vote. So for people like Gary, that's not always good news.
I want to put to stop. There are good Republicans that are hardworking, God-fearing.
Yes.
They are good, and we couldn't have done any of the things that I've described tonight without a partnership between good Republicans and Democrats. And that's the key thing, is that the goal is, and believe me, I'm a partisan. I mean, I run as a Democrat, and I'm not ashamed of it. But at the end of the day, what the people in my district care about is results. How have you made my schools better? How are the roads so I can get to see my grandkids? You know, my medicine's getting awful expensive. Have you done anything to help? Can I vote? Why did it so hard? Why do I take more papers? My mother's voted for 45 years. Now all of a sudden she's got to bring papers. You know, those kinds of questions really drive elections. There are some Republicans, and we'll keep those in a different place, that are more frustrating. But most of the folks, and I'll say this, I've had the privilege of serving in public office for a while. I've served with a lot of people. I would say 99% of the people I worked with, even the ones on the far right that I don't agree with, are good and decent people who want to make a better Kansas. We fight daily about the way to get to a better Kansas, but I never doubted that they wanted that better Kansas. And some of the things we're doing right now in politics are so destructive and so, the politics of personal destruction are making it less attractive for people to run. Who wants to do that for $88 a day? And second of all, it has allowed some of our darker angels loose, and you saw that the other day in Washington, where people carry out politics to an extreme that is not necessary. And I think some of it's on us for turning down that rhetoric a little bit and to say, I can disagree with you on policy. I can think you're absolutely wrong, as I do Chris Kobach, and still recognize that you're a Kansan who wants to try to make the state better. You're just wrong about how to get there. That doesn't make you a bad person, doesn't mean,
Let me ask you this, Jim. A question and a statement, kind of. It feels like a lot of times when you say there's some good Republicans out there, right? And I'm sure that there are. But it feels like rather than really wanting to put out what's best for Kansas, a lot of times when parties change or you get some, some fresh energy in there, it's really in there with the purpose of just tearing down what the other administration, fought to in place. So, it almost feels like maybe it's not about us. It's just about, okay, the Democrats got this together, so now we have some Republicans and their main goal is just to repeal it, But that's kind of how it feels sometimes. I wish there would be some more bipartisan politics that could go on. I think a lot more work could get done. Some more things can get accomplished.
Let's draw a distinction like there is in this table. Washington is a whole different place, okay? And I won't comment on that. I think there are good and decent people who work in Washington, and the federal government has a role. But in Kansas, up until recently, that's been exactly what it is. You had, in my lifetime, we've had as many Democrat governors as Republican governors, and most of Kansas has been governed. If 10 is the most conservative and 1 is the most liberal, between 4 and 6. You get to Mike Hayden, he was more like a 6. Governor Finney was maybe a 4. And Governor Grace from Salina may have been closer to the 4 than the 6. Now Sam Brownback's a 12. Now he jumped from 6 to 12, and that creates a tension that the politic hasn't done. Now I think that's going to, you saw through the election, Kansans like it better in that reasonable common sense. And you don't really, in Topeka, the personal destruction isn't as strong. You don't see press conferences where we're attacking the patriotism of our colleagues. We may disagree strongly on their policies, but we try, and we created rules to do that. But Democrats have a different view of the world as Republicans, even moderate Republicans, and so you've got to work through that. And it's not always a pretty process. It's bloody and it's disagreeable, but at the end of the day, if we do it right, good things happen.
Right. Now, what I'd like to ask you about, second thing, was I'd like for you to speak a little bit about education and the criminal justice system, specifically the death penalty. And what I want to kind of draw a correlation to is usually bad education winds up with full prisons. And for some reason, we seem to want to take money away from education, but still say it's okay to have the death penalty. And it's cool if however you feel about it, but if you know lack of education or poor education or not getting what kids need leads to this, why would we want to push in that direction? I guess the reason why I'm saying it is because when I was young, wheat was the #1 export in Kansas. That's why Wichita State's mascot is a shocker, is a shock of wheat. That represented Kansas. Now we're building so many prisons, and we're calling it CCA, Corrections Corporation of America. And I'd just like you to speak a little bit about, if we're building prisons for profit, can we really get justice?
That's a lot in that. Let's start with the education piece. There's direct correlation with the better educational opportunities, the fewer opportunities that people use the prison system. It disturbs me that the higher education had another tuition increase. We are putting higher education out of reach for too many Kansans. And that's something we have to address long-term, because it's still cheaper to send somebody to a 4-year KU or Kansas Wesleyan or Wichita State than it is to
Lansing or El Dorado.
Exactly. So that is, and we have done some things recently to try to incentivize, to say, let's try to distinguish between violence and people crimes. They get the spaces in Lansing and those El Dorado, and people who do property crimes, which are very important in my area, and maybe some of the drug crimes, and deal with them in a different way unless they earn a bed by disrespecting or continuing to repeat offend. And we've done some things to incentivize while you're in prison to try to get GEDs up, so that education piece. A lot too often people in the prison system are addicted to drugs and alcohol. What are we doing so that, and I could list 10 things that once you're in prison, you have to start all over with. If your license expires, if you were getting any kind of disability benefits, you usually can't go back to your home for a variety of reasons.
Your
and how
ability to vote.
All of these things, and we have, as a state, done some things. Now, the second part of your question, I am always concerned when you make prisons profit motive, because then there becomes, those folks tend to lobby for higher prison sentences because they have a financial incentive. And the criminal justice should be public policy about what we expect as civilized people in a community, what we expect from each other when we live in a civilized community, not because somebody's making money because you got a bed in their private prison. So I've always opposed privatizing prisons. That's a public function, and I've always supported that we should make those beds. There are people who deserve those spots, and I prosecuted for 5 years and met some of those, but they tend to be violent offenders. They tend to be people offenders, the other kinds of crimes. Well, some of them need to go there because they refuse to change behavior and get destructive. There should be better ways to deal with the lower offenders that are more productive for society. And like we were talking about marijuana, somebody asked earlier, that seems to be, while it's still illegal, and there has to be a consequence, it seems very destructive to use prisons or jails, whether you call them local or...
Just fill them with people who got caught with a joint.
Right.
I have actually heard that at one point in time they were building prisons based on third grade test scores. Little Johnny won't sit down. He keeps running around. He's disturbing the other kids. And they take these MAP tests or these aptitude tests, and based on certain test scores, they pretty much are kind of understanding, well, this child is trending a certain way, and we know by the time he's a teenager, we need to have a place for him. I don't know if you've heard that, but I have read some stuff, and it could be some propaganda in there, but I do know that it starts at a very young age. If you can affect a child at 6, 7 years old with the right positive kind of education, then that does make all the difference in the world. And that's generally about 3rd, 4th grade.
And things we can do to support the family.
Now, as we've almost run out of time here this evening, I want to start with Ross. Give us your synopsis of this evening, and mention your website and everything else, my friend.
I would add one thing to what Nelson L. was saying: de-incentivize the drug war. Do not allow asset forfeiture seizures to be to go back to the police. Let that go into the state general fund like Missouri does. That way you don't have a flood in the prisons of drug crimes. That's just my simple answer. But beyond that, you would have my vote if I was a Kansas citizen, Jim. I certainly hope you consider running. rosslong.info for everybody else out there. Have a nice night.
Gary, wrap up this evening and
all right,
give us your final thoughts here.
Representative Ward, you probably have heard of the Kettering Corporation that's doing much of what Nelson, you were speaking about. Has been real influential in Salina and all over the state and all over the country. How much awareness is there about the Kettering Corporation in the House and the Senate in Topeka?
I don't know if it's drilled down that detailed. I think the general concept about private prisons versus public, and the legislature as a whole has tended to avoid privatizing prisons. But drilling it down to a specific corporation, I don't think a lot of folks.
And they're working real, and I'm really glad you're on the panel tonight, Nelson.
Thank you.
All the young age of my son and smart and good-looking.
Thank you.
Well, Nelson, go ahead and give us your synopsis of this evening, and then.
Had a great discussion. I appreciate the representative coming out here. He told me I could call him Jim. So appreciate Jim coming out and having this, frankly, kind of open discussion. He didn't know the questions. So, politicians don't generally do that unless they know what you're going to ask them, So I really appreciate it. I'd like to talk to you some more, so maybe we'll get a chance to do that. You gave me your number. For anybody out here who's wanting to contact me, you can get a hold of me at imnelsonel.com, imnelsonel.com, and I look forward to coming back on the panel again, Jiggy.
Yes. Well, Representative, thanks for being with us this evening. Go ahead and give us a wrap-up here this evening of what you thought, and audience questions, and everything.
I thought it was very exciting, and it was some unique topics that aren't often covered. They typically hit the big 3 or 4.
Yeah.
And so I enjoyed the discussion. I'm glad we had audience participation all the way from Colorado. So it was enjoyable. I hope you invite me back.
Yes. And if you do run for governor, Ross wants to. I got to get it in. Ross and I would love to have you and Carl Brewer, and if anybody can ever contact Josh Shabati, we'd love to have him on the show as well. But that guy has zero social media presence, which is not a good thing if you're running for governor, bud. I want to thank our crew here for Access Television this evening. I want to thank the executive director, Marnie Ryan, for helping put this whole thing together. Of course, the man who doesn't get a lot of talk behind the scenes, Aaron, the genius in the production department. Thank you this evening.
Back there.
And thanks for watching. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, and check out salinatv.org. And good evening, everybody.